Tonight I'll be speaking on one of the first things the Buddha taught, one of the first terms he used to express what he discovered in the search or process, the journey that led to what Buddhists considered to be his awakening. The first opportunity he had to explain his experience to others, he began by referring to the middle way. And I'll use this term to explore various aspects and levels of how we might explore a middle way in our lives. In the basic, or let's say the traditional way that the middle way is often introduced, which refers to the experience of Buddha before awakening. And he contrasted two approaches to spiritual life that were known in the Ganges Valley of India at that time, and that he had tried in various ways. One is indulging in self-punishment or heavy-duty asceticism. There's a strand of religious thinking that treats the senses and or the body as the basic problem, the root of evil, of temptation, and that sort of thing. And to a certain frame of mind, often masculine, the way to deal with this is whip it, punish it, treat it harshly to bring it under control. The Buddha, to be tried that out, almost died in the process and decided that wasn't the way to continue. At other stages in his life, he had led a very pampered existence. The traditional legends speak of him being a prince, though anthropologically, archaeologically, that's almost impossible. But whatever kind of society he grew up in, he was from the top 1%, privileged and pampered, which we can describe as indulging in sensual gratification, an orientation to life that is basically about seeking pleasure and enjoying it in whatever ways are available to us. Some of you will probably recognize that that's strong in our culture, but it seems to me actually we're kind of schizophrenic in that some of the time we're doing the heavy-duty self-mortification, being busy, stressed out, so that at other times we can indulge in gratifying our sensual appetites, whatever they may be. in the early language, a word is used that is interpreted to mean indulging. And it's important to catch this word because many don't and think the Buddha is saying we should do away with sense pleasure, which is, one, not the case, and two, stupid. It's just, you have to be incredibly brutal to yourself to not have any sense pleasure, except in the case of certain extreme illnesses or disabilities. Pain is also part of life, discomfort, hardship. So again, the issue is indulgence, making it a thing, making it a pursuit, an attitude, a habit. That's where things that could just be parts of life become problematic. And so these were two poles that the middle way was described as not drifting off to either form of self-indulgence. Self-indulgence in pain, self-indulgence in pleasure. All of us have experience of pleasure and pain, and probably we all have experiences of indulging one, the other, or both. And so this can be a useful starting point to begin exploring what is a middle way where we're not getting hung up or caught up in either extreme. And again, it's not trying to get rid of pain or pleasure. It's not being trapped by, caught up in, defined by, and so on. So if this inspires us or is meaningful based on our life experience and our reflections on how our lives are working out these days, we could take up this theme as an ongoing exploration, which is how I take all of the Buddha's teachings. Sometimes people assume middle way. Well, if there's extreme A and extreme B, you measure the distance halfway between. That must be the middle way. Or I meet people whose lives are pretty hedonistic. And they think, well, if I cut back halfway, that must be the middle way. Maybe, but maybe not. It's not a matter of pulling out a ruler, or now you can use your iPhone, I guess, and measure. That extreme's 48 meters, this one's 36. Okay, I gotta move that way, what? 7 meters, I don't know. It doesn't work that way because we're alive and life is changing all the time. So the middle way is not some fixed formula, it's a guide to point to finding a dynamic kind of equilibrium and balance that's not stuck anywhere and is adjusting to changing circumstances such as extremely cold weather, bad traffic, being ill, getting older, new job, moving, all these kind of things. How do we work with the vicissitudes of life and find the middle way where we're not getting trapped in pleasure and pain? So I thought tonight I would bring up some other pairs that at least some of them can be seen as opposites. We often think of pleasure and pain as opposed, which doesn't mean the middle way is some neutral, no pleasure, no pain. But that's part of what we learn. So as long as time remains, I'll mention some other pairs. Ones that, for the most part, draw on Buddhist teachings. And hopefully none of these will be disrespectful to other traditions. Another pair is to find the middle between the extremes of foolishly accepting things and rigidly rejecting things. There's a famous teaching where the Buddha advised people who were being visited by all kinds of wandering teachers who often contradicted each other. And so the people in this village, Kesaputta, their heads were kind of spinning. It's like you're channel surfing and you go from Fox News to one of the more liberal. I mean, I don't watch cable, so I don't know what they are anymore. My dad used to have Fox News on, so I'd watch that once in a while. Kind of interesting. And if, you know how it's like if you cable surf or channel surf and you're just kind of get goofy with it, imagine the people of this village being like that. And these visiting teachers would say, I've got the truth, I've got the answer, join my team. Ignore those bad people or those crazies or those socialists or whatever they were who were here last week. And so the Buddha was kind of a smart guy. So he didn't jump in and say, they're all wrong. I've got it. The Buddha's approach was to suggest, don't just accept what someone says and don't merely reject it, which are really the same thing. Instead, listen, ponder what has been said, and reflect how it fits with our own experience. There are things that ordinary, intelligent, thoughtful people with their feet on the ground and a moral compass, there are things we have learned in life. And so take what we're being told, and does it fit with what our life has shown us so far? And that's our approach to discern what's worth, having heard it, what might be worth trying out. So that's another variation on the middle way. If somebody says something and, like, let's say I'm a liberal and some Fox pundit comes on, well, of course he's wrong, right? It's Fox News. Or if one is conservative and it's CNN, well, that's all fake news, right? So that's rigid rejection where we're not even listening. And it can happen, Catholics and Protestants. It happens in Buddhism. In countries like Thailand, there are people, oh, that's Mahayana. You can't listen to them. And then I've heard people who consider themselves Mahayana, oh, those people over there, they're Hinayana, they're just selfish. So ignore them too. So this can show up whether it's politics, religion, at work, where we just reject because it doesn't fit with our opinions, what's comfortable, or what we like to hear. And given the state of things in our country right now, where people are in their little silos echoing each other, and our capacity to talk about pressing issues is close to non-existent on the large scale, at least in smaller groups, if we can refrain from rejecting. And I have friends, if a Democrat says it, they're for it, because they're loyal Democrats. And I have family members, if a Republican says it, it's good. We gotta be loyal to the party. The Buddhas would say that's not the middle way. It's partisan, or it's biased, or it's narrow-minded. It's just rejecting, or accepting things without thought. No religion, political party, government agency, business, or family is free of lies and distortions, whether willful or out of unintentional ignorance. So again, a middle way is take things in, reflect, compare with our own experience rather than rigidly rejecting or foolishly accepting. Here's another pair as I drove down from the driftless region of Wisconsin today. I was hungry at times, and I had snacks, and there are, of course, places to stop. So this one occurred to me, and I was trying to think of ways to frame it. One extreme is to fall into needy hunger. Not just hunger, but a sort of needy hunger. It's, by needy, I mean it's got a bit of desperation. Hunger is part of life, just like pleasure and pain. And so is satiation. But sometimes there's some hunger and we get caught up in it, and all of a sudden we're needy and desperate. I would say that's not the middle way. And then the other, we're hungry, because it's a natural thing every day. Most of us, at least, need food. The body has its mechanisms to remind these crazy minds of ours with our overactive neocortexes. So the body sends signals called hunger. And sometimes we latch onto those and start fantasizing about what'll taste good. And we're constantly bombarded with ads in all the different media to program us what is supposed to be tasty, though as far as I can tell, it often turns out to be fairly bland. But that's okay because they use all kinds of manipulation to fool us. But the part I want to emphasize here is in our own minds, we start to see tastiness. We want something more from food than satisfying hunger. And unfortunately, the more often leads to unhealthy eating. Too much sugar, too much processed starch, a lot of pesticides and unhealthy chemicals, etc., etc. So again, the middle way is to navigate this territory where we respond to hunger in a middle way approach. That's not just trying to find tasty stuff to excite, to stimulate, nor fall into desperation and neediness. So I thought I'd use an example like this because food is something we can't do without. And so it's an important way to explore the middle way. There's an attitude that comes up in some corners of Buddhism that non-attachment or letting go means kind of getting rid of stuff. And there probably is a lot of stuff worth getting rid of. But there's other things like food that, as far as I can tell, has a certain necessity. So it would be way too simplistic and crude to think, let's get rid of food. The middle way is not getting desperate about hunger and not using food as an excuse to stimulate. Because we are in a culture that uses the word excitement as a synonym for happiness. Have you noticed that? It struck me, I don't know, 10 years ago. Generally people younger than me, but since we're a youth, we're an aging phobic culture. Older folks don't like acting their age, so we pick up the jargon of young folks instead of sticking with our language like groovy and cool words like that. Anyway, it struck me a while ago that some people never spoke of being happy, they just spoke of being excited. And I wonder, what's going on that what people seek is excitement? I think I have a lot of confidence the Buddha would not consider that the middle way. I could be wrong. It's up to each of us to work out for ourselves. I just mentioned happiness, so I'll use that as another part of a pair, the pair of happy and sad. My take on these words are their natural feelings. I'm using the words a little loosely right now, but things happen and we're happy about it. Other things happen and we're sad. As far as I can tell, happiness and sadness are just fluctuations in how we feel. Completely natural. And trying to have one without the other is silly. Because there's a lot of things that to be happy about it would be really inappropriate. Somebody being sick, and our response is, oh, that's cool, I'm still happy. If you're the one who's sick, you may not appreciate somebody being happy seemingly at our expense or oblivious to our situation. But it can go the other way where I'm doing okay and you decide you're going to be sad about that. Some people really like to camp out on the sad side. Others may be the happy side. But what if these are natural feelings? And that's kind of how I want to use the words right now. That change with changing circumstances. And sometimes we feel sad and it changes. Sometimes we feel happy and it changes. If life is fluid change and fluctuation between these poles, or let's call it a spectrum, sometimes it's mild happiness, mild sadness. And I'm not going to argue for trying to camp out in some neutral, never happy, never sad. That's a gross distortion of the Buddha's teaching, I feel. But just flowing with certain things are very sad. Like when I contemplate if the climate scientists are anywhere close to on track with what's happening, it's pretty sad. The news gets, there's bad news every week. And I have this bad habit of doing what I just did. I'm noticing it and catching it more. That kind of chuckle, but really it's sad. And maybe I chuckle because it's hard to take in how sad that is, or the resurgence of white supremacy since we elected an African American as president. There's plenty of sad things, yet did any of you see the eclipse last Sunday? We had a little viewing party, though it was pretty cold up in Wisconsin. There are still things like that that are genuinely awe-inspiring. Or the snow we've just had. To me, things like this are beautiful, or an act of kindness when one person is kind to someone, perhaps for no reason, just the goodness in their heart at that moment. For situations like that, why not allow happiness, just like other times we allow sadness? The difficulty is when we want one and not the other. Seems to me that's impossible, so we set ourselves up for frustration, conflict, or we can't deal with sadness and it depresses us. Or we can't deal with happiness and we get goofy and silly and careless. So I'll suggest the middle way is to accept happiness, sadness as they come without chasing after one rather than the other, and not getting stuck in either one. And again, this would be the dynamic equilibrium of the middle way. Happy and sad, from there, the next pair I'll bring up is love and hate, often seen as opposites. And nowadays we love chocolate cookies. Do people love the Cubs or the Bears anymore? Some might. In Wisconsin, I think there are people who love the Packers. So I know the word love can be used in much more appropriate ways, but the fact it often gets thrown around in really trivial ways, like loving chocolate cookies, or I hate olives. I'm not a fan of olives myself, but I don't hate them. I just avoid them. But if they're on the pizza, I'll pick some off, I'll eat the rest. It doesn't kill me. I remember back during the Democratic primary, I had friends who hated Hillary because they were Bernie supporters, and friends who hated Bernie because they were Hillary supporters. Or some, it wasn't quite as blatant, they hated the Bernie supporters. Bernie wasn't so bad, but boy, those supporters of his it's what's going on when our emotional range is so extreme and distorted. A few things I would say, and I'll tie this back with happiness and sadness and pleasure and pain. There's stuff we like. We tend to like pleasure and happiness. We tend not to like pain, discomfort, distress, sadness, though some people kind of like sadness, maybe. Liking and disliking, and then if our intellectual range is stunted, and I'm thinking of people I know who are smart people, but when they get touched off, their intelligence disappears and they fall into the love-hate dichotomy, What's going on there when normally intelligent people who are intelligent, at least some of the time, throw that out the window to be in this fairly extreme dichotomy? Love and hate in such cases may be labels or concepts where we can't just go, yeah, this is unpleasant for me, I don't like it. Why can't we just recognize that? Why do we gotta blow it up into hatred? Which, to me, seems to be really stuck. If we've worked ourselves up to that degree, we're stuck, not the middle way. What about with love? So I'll stick with the more trivialized forms of love, where, again, we can't just say, yes, I enjoy this tastes good. It's healthy food, tastes good, well-made, I appreciate it. It brings a certain pleasure. Great. Why does it have to be worked up into, oh, I love it, and I'm going to take pictures and put it on Facebook? And I apologize for saying so, but people going to chain restaurants and loving the stuff served in them, it might be adequate. I had lunch at Panera's today, but you can disagree with me, of course. But love and hate, if we watch some of the manifestations, they get stuck in stances. And to be stuck is we can make dungeons out of not only hatred, but love. Now, of course, in spiritual teachings of many flavors, there's a kind of love or compassion that has nothing to do with these simplistic and trivial dichotomies. And that's a whole nother story. One reason I bring up being stuck in love is, what if letting ourselves get hooked into these trivial forms of love cheapens our capacity to reach out into and grow into a genuinely mature love, whether it's love for our family members, our country, our species, all living things, all creation, as well as the divine or God or Dhamma in Buddhist terms. Now it's time to bring up one of the most famous dichotomies of all, good and evil. This one is so important that it has a crucial place in the book of Genesis of the Old Testament. The myth that's recorded there, and apologies to anyone who insists it's factually true, it might be, but I take it as myth, just like I take the old Buddhist stories as myth. Myths can have a lot of truth, and I believe this myth does. That when Adam and Eve ate the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which is the official name, at least in translation. I don't read Hebrew. But growing up, we only hear about the apple, even though there probably weren't any apples there. But the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, they ate it, and God had no choice, but they got kicked out of Eden. Now, we could read that as God is a sore loser, or he's a kind of controlling or a control freak, gives orders and wants them followed to the letter. But a Buddhist reading could be, or this is my teacher's reading, at some point in our species' evolution, our nervous system and language and intellectual capabilities started to conceive of good and evil and began to judge things in our own subjective terms. Things we like, things that taste good, things that feel good, things that are comfortable, convenient, we often describe them as good. I lead many meditation retreats every year, and people will come in and say, "Oh, I had a good meditation." And if there's time, I ask, "Oh, why do you say that?" A fair percentage of the time, it's because they felt good. They were more relaxed and comfortable. Nothing wrong with that, but to me it illustrates our tendency to assume certain things are good because they feel good, they're comfortable, they're convenient, and so on. And then a meditation where my mind's wandering all the time, or my back is sore, or the person next to me is snoring and it really distracts. Those are bad meditations. I'm not feeling good the way I want to feel, or I'm annoyed, or I'm frustrated by my crazy thoughts. Bad meditation. I'm just using that to illustrate the way we conceptualize good and evil and then judge. And that's part of the process that leads to love and hate. And if we don't look more carefully, we don't realize how subjective and relative our concepts of good and evil are. Plus, we project them onto ourselves, and we want to be good people. Now, there's something very good in that. But then it easily becomes, am I good enough? How do I know I'm good? And this aspiration to be good can cause suffering, can make us uptight, can make us competitive. Well, I'm not sure I'm good, but I'm better than him. At least in the narrow way I'm using to judge, to make myself feel good. This is not a healthy spiritual path. And we can project our notions of good and evil onto others. This goes on a lot in our society, and a lot of the major fissures which have become chasms are because of different conceptions of what's good and evil. And too often clinging to one's own versions of good and evil as the truth, without the capacity to see it as my truth, relative and limited. Nope, God said, or Buddha said, or the figurehead of our party, or Bill Gates, or whoever, Steve Jobs, whoever we idolize. And it gets fixed. And we put it up in some untouchable position. And then we're way off the middle way. So as I've said with other things like pleasure and pain, it's not that there's no good in the world and no evil. But if we're not careful, we eat the fruit and we get trapped in these concepts. And we do a lot of damage to ourselves and others, which is not a middle way. And this leads me to something that often grows out of the kind of dichotomies like good and evil I've been discussing, us and them. A couple years ago, in various groups in the Midwest, I was using Buddha's teachings to do some inquiries about race. And generally, these were largely white groups, occasionally some, but small numbers of people of color. And how easily it was for quite a few middle-class white people to speak in terms of us and them. And these were nice people, liberal people, kind of my people. But there are other human beings who aren't us. They're them. And in this case, on the basis of skin color. And in a number of Midwestern cities like Chicago, Milwaukee, Detroit, some neighborhoods are where they live. Some neighborhoods are where we live. And there's the beliefs that grow out of that. Well, that's kind of a dangerous place. I never go there. And so we separate into our us's and them's. Same thing can happen with gender. Get some men together and they might start saying stupid things about wives. It's possible women never do the opposite. I won't hazard a guess. We do it with sexual orientation and other things where we take a certain characteristic that connects us with some people. Often there's superficial stuff like skin color or apparent gender. And we have all our cues, hairstyles, clothing, the kind of earrings we wear, and so on. Facial hair. We use these clues, and it seems to me natural that we recognize similarities. But then we take it further and we create a boundary. There's us, and then there's them. And us and them, because we want to be good, we want us to be good. And the same way, for me to be good, it's helpful if he's not so good, because then I'm better, right? Or we're good people, they're not, whoever we choose to scapegoat. So here's another, and I would say currently really evil form of extremes, where we've got this us-them dichotomy. Now, it's partly just language. Okay, there are legitimate uses of pronouns. I, you, us, them, fine. But in our minds where we use these to separate, because every them still has similarities with us. But when we create the separation, us, them, we tend to deny similarities that whatever the basis of us, them, say skin color, or how we dress. If we latch onto that, then we deny perhaps more important similarities. Buddhism would say, well, the fact that we're all born, we all age, lose things that matter to us or that we hold dear, we get sick and we die. Or we all seek happiness and well-being, and yet we all experience pain and suffering. That's true of all human beings, all mammals, all animals. I would say on some level, all living things. But us, them, wants to ignore these fundamental similarities, where the middle way can recognize differences and similarities, but not get trapped or bogged down in them. And given the state of our society right now, it seems to me really crucial, if we value peace, if we want everyone to have a decent chance for a decent life with reasonable health and happiness, then dialing back on the us and the them stuff will be crucial. I'd like to close with another possible dichotomy that operates around a common spiritual metaphor. Many of us have probably heard the comparison that there are many paths to the mountaintop, but they all lead to the same place. Now, nobody actually knows if that's true. It's a nice idea, open-minded, but we all take our own path to the mountaintop. We have no idea whether the other paths lead there, except if we get there and meet someone, oh, you came up the other side, great. But if we're still climbing, we don't know if our path will make it, let alone the others. But anyway, it's a nice metaphor. And because it's meant to be open-minded and respectful, it's generally quite healthy. But I want to examine this notion of climbing the mountain or ascent, especially in masculine religiosity as it's been over the last couple thousand years. The ascent is given a lot of prominence, or sometimes in the language of transcendence. In my tradition, there are people who want to transcend and are hoping to live in very refined ways where they don't have to get mucked up by the ordinary business of life. What if to be stuck on the mountaintop is to be stuck? And what if the metaphor of ascent or transcendence, I would say it's still a metaphor, also needs to be in equilibrium with descent, especially those of us who meditate and have access to some quite refined, beautiful experiences. But if you try to stay there, what happens? The laundry piles up, the bills don't get paid, the cat box doesn't get scooped out and gets really stinky. We've got to go to the toilet, etc., etc. Certain forms of religion really play up life on the pedestal. And we even try to create saints who we keep up there. And heaven forbid they should slip up, because we can be vicious when they do. What if spiritual life is the capacity to ascend, descend as circumstances warrant? Not always be struggling here in the world of strife, of traffic, of taxes, of political conflict. But what if that's just part of life to embrace as much as the ascent part? So I'll leave that for your own examination. Not so much as a dogmatic truth, but more of a challenge to the ways our minds create concepts when we explore spiritual teachings of whatever form. And it happens with science, political ideologies, and so on. We create conceptions. That's what our minds do. But often our conceptions start to rigidify and then aren't subject to further learning. If we're inspired by notions of ascent or transcendence, great. There's something very valuable in that. But watch out if we think that's all there is. Because up there may not be much real compassion. Just looking down from one's lofty vantage point. easily becomes pity, which is much different than compassion or love. So, those are some reflections on middle way and navigating dichotomies, opposites, and extremes. Not that we need to erase all such things, but more so we aren't trapped in and limited by these things or our conceptions of them.
I guess one of the questions I have is, why are we built to have a bias towards pleasure? It seems like we're physiologically built that way.
I don't know,
Yeah.
but my guess is when the organism has shelter, safety, food, there's a level of relaxing satiation or comfort, which feels good. And so I'm guessing we evolved to have this kind of binary system of pleasure and pain. And in many ways, it's a simple mechanism to, like pain is a signal something's not quite right. Unfortunately, we develop opinions, attitudes, ideologies that confuse the natural mechanism. And that gets us into trouble as humans. I'm not speaking about dogs and cats.
Do you think that it's possible that whatever species had a bias towards pain just didn't survive?
They thought it was so cool to have your head ripped off by a predator. That would make it hard to survive.
It's not a question, it's just a comment. I'm just thinking about your last comparison with the ascending and descending, and I'm just kind of twirling about it because it makes so much sense. It's always felt, the spiritual path has always felt sort of like a game of chutes and ladders. You know, you go up a little bit, you come down a little bit. You go up a little bit, and you come down a little bit. And I think that we tend to, or maybe just I tend to wonder what happened, or maybe not blame, but just wonder, did I mess up? Did something happen? You know, why am I losing ground in this? And perhaps it's just exactly what you stated, which is that's the pattern to it, and one is just as important as the other. And I really like that.
And it's for you to reflect and explore, is it losing ground? Because some cases it may be we indulged in envy or spitefulness. I would say that's losing ground. But other times, some of these more refined things may not be sustainable. And so they come and they go, just like pleasure and pain. And there are, if it helps, there are stories of pretty inspiring spiritual role models like Ramana Maharshi, who endured incredible pain as he was dying of cancer. Did that mean he was losing ground? in a certain moralistic, judgmental mind frame, yes. Oh, he must not have been so enlightened if he's experienced so much pain. There's an attitude like that, oh, that God or karma is punishing.
It's interesting how we use linear terminology to talk about the path or the mountain, up, down. You know, I'm making progress, I'm losing ground. And I don't know, these days that doesn't feel like an appropriate way to talk about what it is we're doing. I've come to the realization for myself, it's all the path. There is no on the path, off the path, forward, backward. The path is what's right underneath you right now. And then whatever you do in the next moment, that's the next part of the path. And it disappears behind you. There's nothing in front of you. It crumbles behind you. And all you've got is what you're standing on right now. That helps me a little bit to not be so judgmental if I do what I used to conceptualize as falling off the path or backward steps or things like that. We just are where we are.
Yeah, and if I may, like, looking back on some things that I might have thought was falling off the path, but at that time, that might have been all I was able to do, and I had to learn. And so maybe it was just what it was, and that superficial judgment. And something else I heard in what you said when you brought up linear. Linear makes sense if there's past and future. So if we've got the arrow of time, but you were speaking of if it's just right here, there's no linear.
I just had a comment about the trying to stay in a lofty place in our spiritual path, and I think simply out of the necessity of being human, that tells you that's not right to do that. We have work here in the physical, and otherwise we wouldn't be here. So, and just a comment on that.
A beautiful one.
Thank you for the lecture. I really enjoyed it. Thank you. Very practical question, except for meditation, of course. Do you have any secret methods that you practice middle way, like everyday routine kind of things? How can we practice it more?
Something I've been, well, there are a lot of little tricks. Here's one my AA friends use that applies to me. These days I have, with my wife, a lot of work to do. And if I'm thinking ahead to stuff I have to do, like drive here, if I was thinking about that yesterday, I would have gotten stressed out. But the phrase I've heard from some AA friends is the next right thing. It's kind of like you're right here. What's the thing to do right here now? And so that's a little mnemonic device that I use to be mindful of, just because I also have a tendency to procrastinate. If something's, I'm lacking a little confidence, or it's awkward, like calling up, I don't like making phone calls to corporations. And so I'll put it off. But if I am mindful of the next right thing, well, it needs to be done, just do it.